Section 46 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. John Inglesant, A Romance by Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Chapter 29. On his arrival at Florence, Inglesant found himself at once feted and caressed, though the nature of his mission to Umbria, antagonistic as his supposed influence had been to the interests of the ducal party, might naturally have procured for him a far different reception. Trained as he had been in courts, the caprices of princes' favour did not seem strange to him, and were taken at their true worth. Unsuspicious, therefore, of any special danger, relieved from the intolerable strain which the position at Umbria had exerted upon his conscience, delighted with the society of his recovered mistress, and flattered by the attentions of the Duchess and of the whole court, he gave himself up freely to the enjoyments of the hour. Plentifully supplied with money from his own resources, from the kindness of the aged Duke, and from the subsidies of his patrons at Rome, he engaged freely in the parties formed for the performance of masques and interludes, in which the court delighted, and became conspicuous for the excellence of his acting and invention. But it was not the purpose of the demon that followed on his footsteps to give him longer repose than might lull his senses and weaken his powers of resisting evil. Day after day devoted to pleasure paved the way for the final catastrophe, until the night arrived when the plot was fully ripe. Supper was over, and the court sat down again to play. Inglesant remembered afterwards, though at the time it did not attract his attention, that several gentlemen, all of them friends of Gardino, paid him particular attention, and insisted on drinking with him, calling for different kinds of wine, and recommending them to his notice. The saloons were crowded and very hot, and when Inglesant left the supper-room and came into the brilliant marble hall, lighted with great lustres, where the court was at play, he was more excited than was his wont. The court was gathered at different tables, a very large one in the centre of the hall, and other smaller ones around. The brilliant dresses, the jewels, the beautiful women, the reflections in the numberless mirrors made a dazzling and mystifying impression on his brain. The play was very high, and at the table to which Inglesant sat down especially so. He lost heavily, and this did not tend to calm his nerves. He doubled his stake with all the money he had with him, and lost again. As he rose from the table, a page touched his elbow and handed him a small note carefully sealed and delicately perfumed. It was addressed to him by his new title, Il Cavaliere di San Giorgio, and scarcely knowing what he did, he opened it. It was from Loretta. Cavaliere, will you come to me in the Duchess's lodgings before the court rises from play? I need your help. L. Inglesant turned to look for the boy, who, he expected, was waiting for him. He was not far off, and Inglesant followed him without a word. They passed through many corridors and rooms richly furnished until they reached the lodgings of the Grand Duchess. The night was sultry, and through the open windows above the gardens the strange odours that are born of darkness and of night entered the palace. In the dark arcades the nightingales were singing, preferring gloom and mystery to the light in which all other creatures rejoice. And in the stillness the murmur of brooks and the splash of the fountains oppressed the air with an unearthly and unaccustomed sound. Around the casements festoons of harmless and familiar flowers and leaves assumed wild and repulsive shapes, as if transformed into malicious demons who made men their sport. Inglesant thought involuntarily of those plants that are at enmity with man, which are used for enchantments and for poisoning, and whose very scent is death. Such saturnine and fatal flowers seem more at home in the lovely Italian night than the innocent plants which witness to lovers' vows, and upon which divines moralize and preach. The rooms of the Duchess were full of perfume of the kind that enervates and lulls the sense. It seemed to Inglesant as though he were treading the intricate pathways of a dream, careless as to what befell him, yet with a passionate longing which urged him forward, heedless of a restraining voice which he was even then half conscious that at other times he should have heard. The part of the palace where he was seemed deserted, and the page led him through more than one ante-room without meeting any one, until they reached a curtained door, which the boy opened and directed Inglesant to enter. He did so, and found himself at once in the presence of Loretta, who was lying upon a low seat at the open window. The room was lighted by several small lamps in different positions, giving an ample yet at the same time a soft and dreamy light. Loretta was carelessly dressed, yet in the soft light and in her negligent attitude there was something that made her beauty the more attractive, and her manner to Inglesant was unrestrained and clinging. Her growing affection, the urgency of her need, and the circumstances of the hour caused her innocently to speak and act in a way the most fitted to promote her brother's atrocious purposes. "Cavaliere," she said, "I've sent for you because I have no friend but you. I've sent for you to help me against my own family, my own brother, my father even, whom I love, whom I loved more than all the world beside. They are determined to marry me to a man whom I hate, to the man whom you hate, to that Signore Malvolti, who, though they deny it, is, I am fully persuaded, the murderer of your brother, to that wretch whom Italy even refuses to receive, who but for his useful crimes would be condemned to a death of torment. My brother tells me that he will be here tomorrow to see me and demand my consent. He brings an authorization from my father, and insists upon the contract being made without delay. I would die rather than submit to such a fate, but it is not necessary to die. I must, however, leave the court and escape from my brother's wardship. If I can reach some place of safety where I can gain time to see my father, I am certain that I shall be able to move him. It cannot be that he will condemn me to such a fate, me, the pride and pleasure of his life. He must be deceived and misled by some of these wicked intrigues and manoeuvres which ruin the happiness and peace of men." "I am wholly yours," said Inglesant. "Whatever you desire shall be done. Have you spoken to the Duchess?" "The Duchess advises me to fly," replied Loretta. "She says the Duke will not interfere between a father and his child, especially now when all Italy hangs in suspense concerning the papacy, and when men are careful whom they offend. She advises me to go to the convent of St. Catherine of Pistoia, where I lodged not many years ago while my father was in France. The abbess is a cousin of my father's. She is a kind woman, and I can persuade her to keep me for a short time at least. I wish to go to-night. Will you take me?" She had never looked so lovely in Inglesant's eyes as she did while she spoke. The pleading look of her dark eyes and the excitement of her manner, usually so reserved and calm, added charms to her person of which he had previously been unconscious. In that country of formal restraint and suspicion of hurried, furtive interviews, a zest was given to accidental freedom of intercourse, such as the more unrestricted life of France and England knew little of. In spite of a suspicion of treachery which in that country was never absent, Inglesant felt his frame aglow with devotion to this lovely creature who thus threw herself unreservedly into his keeping. He threw himself upon a cushion at Loretta's feet and encircled her with his arms. She spoke of youth and life and pleasure, of youth that was passing away so rapidly, of life that had been to her dreary and dull enough. of her jealousy-guarded Italian home, of her convent cell, of her weak and helpless father, of her tyrannous brother, of pleasure of which she had dreamed as a girl, but which seemed to fly before her as she advanced, finally of himself, whom from the first day she had seen him in her father's room she had loved, whom absence had only endeared her first and only friend. He spoke of love, of protection, of help and succour for the rest of life, of happy days to come at San Gorgio, when all these troubles should have passed away, when at last he should escape from intrigue and state policy, and they could make their home as joyous and free from care as that house of a cardinal on a little hilly bank near Velletri, whence you can see the sea, and which is called Monte Gioiosa. He spoke of an idyllic dream which could not long have satisfied either of them, himself especially, but which pleased them at that moment, with an innocent and delicate fancy which calmed and purified their excited thoughts. Then, as the hour passed by, he rose from her embrace, promising to provide horses, and when the palace was quiet, to meet her at the end of one of the long avenues that crossed the park, for the court was not at the Pitti Palace, but at the Poggio Imperiale, without the walls of Florence. The soft night air played upon Inglesant's forehead as he led his horses to the end of a long avenue and waited for the lady to join him. He did not wait long. She came gliding past the fountains, by the long rows of orange and cypress hedges, and across the streaks of moonlight among the trees that closed the gardens and the park. As he lifted her into the saddle, her glance was partly scared and partly trustful. He felt as though he were moving in a delicious dream. As they rode out of the park, she told him that she had received a message from the Duchess recommending her to stop at a pavilion on the borders of the great chase beyond the Acciaiano Palace, halfway to Pistoria, which the Duchess used sometimes when the Duke was diverting himself in the chase. She had sent a messenger to prepare the people who kept the pavilion for their coming. There was something strange in this message, Loretta said, which was brought not by one of the Duchess's usual pages, but by a boy who had not been long at the palace, and who scarcely waited to give them his message, so great was his hurry. It seemed of little moment to Inglesant who brought the message, or whether any treachery were at work or no. He was only conscious of a delicious sense of coming pleasure, which made him reckless of all beside. Along the first few miles of their road they passed nothing but the long lines of elms, planted between ridges of corn, upon which the vines were climbing in already luxuriant wreaths. Presently, however, after they had passed the Acciaiano Palace, the country changed, and they came within the confines of the Duke's chase, 30 miles in compass, planted with cork trees and ilex, with underwood of myrtle thickets. Through these shades, lovely indeed by day, but weird and unhealthy by night, they rode silently, startled every now and then by strange sounds that issued from the forest depths. The ground was fenny and uneven, and moist exhalations rose out of the soil and floated across the path. "The Duchess never sleeps at the pavilion," said Loretta at last suddenly. "It is dangerous to sleep in the forest." "It will be as well to stop an hour or so, however," said Inglesant, "else we shall be at Pistoia before they open the gates." Presently, in the brilliant moonlight, they saw the pointed roofs of the pavilion on a little rising ground, with the forest trees coming up closely to the walls. The moon was now high in the heavens, and it was as light as day. The upper windows of the pavilion were open, and within its lights were burning. The door was opened to them before they knocked, and the keeper of the pavilion came to meet them, accompanied by a boy who took the horses. The man showed no surprise at their coming, only saying some servants of the Duchess had been there a few hours previously, and had prepared a repast in the dining-room, forewarning him that he should expect visitors. He accompanied them upstairs, for they saw nothing of the other inmates of the place. The rooms were arranged with a sort of rustic luxury, and were evidently intended for repose during the heat of the day. A plentiful and delicate collation was spread on one of the tables, with abundance of fruit and wine. The place looked like the magic creation of an enchanter's wand, raised for purposes of evil from the unhealthy marsh, and ready to sink again when that malefic purpose was fulfilled into the weird depths from which it rose. The old man showed them the other rooms of the apartment and left them. At the door he turned back and said, "I should not advise the lady to sleep here. The miasma from the forest is very fatal to such as are not used to it." Inglesant looked at him, but could not perceive that he intended his words to have any deeper meaning than the obvious one. He said, "We shall stay only an hour or two. Let the horses be ready to go on." The man left them, and they sat down at the table. The repast was served in viands ware of a strange, delicate blue, and consisted of most of the delicacies of the season, with a profusion of wine. "This was not ordered by the Duchess," said Loretta. "We are safe from poison, mignonne," said Inglesant. "To destroy you as well as me would defeat all purposes. Not that I believe the cavaliere would wish me dead. He rather hopes that I may be of use to him. Let us drink to him." And he filled a glass for Loretta of the Montepulciano, the king of wines, and drank himself. Loretta was evidently frightened, yet she followed his example and drank. The night air was heavy and close. Not a breath of wind stirred the lights, though every window was thrown open, and the shutters that closed the loggia outside were drawn back. In the brilliant moonlight every leaf of the great forest shone with an unnatural distinctness, which, set in a perfect silence, became terrible to see. The silvern arcades seemed like a painted scene piece upon a satanic stage, supernaturally alight to further deeds of sin, and silent and unpeopled, lest the wrong should be interrupted or checked. To Inglesant's excited fancy, evil beings thronged its shadowy paths, present to the spiritual sense, though concealed of set purpose from the feeble human sight. The two found their eyes drawn with a kind of fascination to this strange sight, and Inglesant arose and closed the shutters before the nearest casement. They felt more at ease when the mysterious forest was shut out, but Loretta was silent and troubled, and Inglesant's efforts to cheer and enliven her were not successful. The delicious wines to which he resorted to remove his own uneasiness and to cure his companion's melancholy failed of their effect. At last she refused to drink, and rising up suddenly, she exclaimed, "Oh, it is terribly hot! I cannot bear it. I wish we had not come." She wandered from the room in which they sat through the curtained doorway into the next, which was furnished with couches, and sank down on one of them. The Inglesant followed her, and, as if the heat felt stifling also to him, went out upon the open verandah and looked upon the forest once more. Excited by the revels of the past few days, heated with wine, with the night ride, and with the overpowering closeness of the air, the temptation came upon him with a force which he had neither power nor desire to resist. He listened, but no sound met his ear, no breath stirred, no living being moved, no disturbance need be dreaded from any side. From the people in the pavilion he looked for no interference. From the object of his desires he had probably no need to anticipate any disinclination but what might easily be soothed away. The universal custom of the country in which he was now almost naturalized sanctioned such acts. The hour was admirably chosen, the place perfectly adapted in every way, as if the result not of happy chance but deeply concerted plan. Why then did he hesitate? Did he still partly hope that some miracle would happen, or some equally miraculous change take place in his mind and will to save him from himself? It is true the place and the temptation were not of his own seeking. So far he was free from blame. But he had not come wholly unharmed out of the fiery trial at Umbria, and by a careless walk since he came to Florence he had prepared the way for the tempter, and this night even he had disregarded the warning voice and drifted recklessly onward. We walk of our own free will, heated and inflamed by wine, down the flowery path which we have ourselves decorated with garlands, and we murmur because we reach the fatal goal. He gazed another moment over the illumined forest, which seemed transfigured in the moonlight and the stillness into an unreal landscape of the dead. The poisonous mists crept over the tops of the cork trees and flitted across the long vistas in spectral forms, cowled and shrouded for the grave. Beneath the gloom indistinct figures seemed to glide, the personation of the miasma that made the place so fatal to human life. He turned to enter the room, but even as he turned a sudden change came over the scene. The deadly glamour of the moonlight faded suddenly. A calm, pale, solemn light settled over the forest. The distant line of hills shone out distinct and clear. The evil mystery of the place departed whence it came. A fresh and cooling breeze sprang up and passed through the rustling wood, breathing pureness and life. The day spring was at hand in the eastern sky. The rustling breeze was like a whisper from heaven that reminded him of his better self. It would seem that hell overdid it. The very stillness for miles around, the almost concerted plan, sent flashing through his brain the remembrance of another house, equally guarded for a like purpose, a house at Nuneham, near Oxford, into which years ago he had himself forced his way to render help in such a case as this. Here was the same thing happening over again, with the actors changed. Was it possible that such a change had been wrought in him? The long past life of those days rushed into his mind, the sacramental Sundays, the repeated vows, the light of heaven in the soul, the kneeling forms in Little Gidding Chapel, the face of Mary Colette, the loveliness that blessed the earth where she walked, her deathbed and her dying words. What so rarely happened here. The revulsion of feeling, the rush of recollection and association was too powerful for the flesh. The reason and the affections rallied together, and trained into efficiency by past discipline, regained the mastery by a supreme effort, even at the very moment of unsatisfied desire. But the struggle was fierce. He was torn like the demon-haunted child in the gospel story, but as in that story the demon was expelled. He came back into the room. Loretta lay upon a couch with rich drapery and cushions, her face buried in her hands. The cloak and hood in which she had ridden were removed, and the graceful outline of her figure was rendered more alluring by the attitude in which she lay. As he entered, she raised her head from her hands and looked at him with a strange, apprehensive, expectant gaze. He remained for a moment silent, his face very pale. Then he said slowly and uncertainly, like a man speaking in a dream, "The fatal miasma is rising from the plain. Loretta, this place is safe for neither of us. We had better go on." The morning was cloudy and chill. They had not ridden far before a splash of thunder rain fell, and the trees dripped dismally. A sense of discomfort and disappointment took possession of Inglesant, and so far from deriving consolation from his conquest, he seemed torn by the demon of discontent. He was half conscious that his companion was regretting the evil and luxurious house they had left. The ride to Pistoia was silent and depressed. As they passed through the streets, early as it was, they were watched by two figures half concealed by projecting walls. One of them was the cavalier, the other was tall and dark. Whether it was the devil in the person of Malvolti or Malvolti himself is not of much consequence, nor would the difference be great. In either case the issue was the same. The devil's plot had failed. It is not so easy to ruin him with whom the pressure of Christ's hand yet lingers in the palm. When Inglesant presented himself again at the convent grate after a few hours' sleepless unrest at an inn, he was refused admittance, nor did repeated applications during that day and the next meet with a more favourable response. He became the prey of mortification and disgust that, having had the prize in his hand, he had of his own free will passed it into the keeping of another. On the evening of the third day, however, he received a note from Loretta, informing him that her brother had consented to postpone her betrothal to Malvolti indefinitely, and that she, on her part, had promised not to see Inglesant again until the papal election had been decided. She entreated her lover not to attempt to disturb this compromise, as by so doing he would only injure her whom he had promised to help. She promised to be true and did not doubt, but that, having obtained the delay she sought, she should be able to gain her father's consent to their marriage, especially if the papal election took the course they hoped it would. There was something cold and formal about the wording of this note, which, however, might be explained by its contents having been dictated to the writer. But unsatisfactory as it was, Inglesant was compelled to acquiesce in the request it contained. He was angry and disappointed, and it must be admitted that he had some cause. His mistress and his pleasant life at the ducal court had vanished in the morning mist and rain, like the delusive pleasures of a dream, and the regret which a temptation yielded to would leave behind is not always counterbalanced by a corresponding elation when the trial is overcome. He departed for Rome, having sent orders to Florence for his servants and baggage to meet him on the road, and the same night on which he entered the city Pope Innocent X expired. End of section 46.